Hi, my name is Kevin Corzo, and this is my presentation, How Success Can Mean Nothing for a Woman. So the article that I chose for my presentation is called Don't Act Crazy, Mindy. And the idea behind it was that anytime there's like a woman in power or like a woman like in a position of authority, she's famous, she's a lawyer, she's a doctor, in law enforcement, just anywhere where, you would associate with like a certain like respect being given to you or like power. It usually is not because they earn their way there in television. It's because of some X factor that like makes it so that they got there. So to give an example that they use in the article, um, the writer uses Nurse Jackie, who abuses prescription pills to kind of like lock in and then be a great nurse, which that makes sense. Obviously, if you're like locked in as a nurse, you would be like great at what you do. But it's not that Nurshaki is actually good at what she does. The show frames it as if she's only good at what she does because of the film. So basically, that's kind of like the idea. It's like women aren't good at what they do to get in those positions. It's because they have some like extenuating factor to get there, whether it's like, you know, abusing a prescription, some diagnosis like ADHD or something like that, or like kind of like Good Doctor, how he has like autism, so he's good at that. I like being a doctor. So that kind of logic could just apply it to like women across the board. Like it's never like a woman is just good at what she does. Like it's always because of some X factor. Versus how sometimes like I give the Good Doctor as an example of like a man who has like that X factor that makes him good at what he does. But then you also just have instances where men are just good at what they do. They're they're just professionals or they're prodigies, what have you. So yeah, that's kind of like the essence of the article. And it also that women who, are commanding and like dominant in that like professional sense or like in their space come off as like threatening or bitchy to men who are also in that space. So the concepts that I was focused on for this one are images of women, which is chapter 3, and then chapter 10, which is work and achievement. So for images of women, that kind of focuses on the the perception of women versus the perception of men within society, especially when they're doing like really similar things. So the way that I understood it was like to give an example, if a guy sleeps around, he's seen as like, he's a player, he's charismatic, he's charming. Like generally it's seen as like a positive thing. But then if a woman sleeps around, she's seen as like, she's a slut, she's promiscuous, she's a whore. It's like seen as a negative. It's the same act on both ends, but society frames it differently depending on like what gender you are. So the article uses the example, well, she gives an anecdote about how her ex called her a psycho chick, but she kind of reflected on that and how women who stand up to, men, women who kind of are confident in themselves and, they know what they want, they're kind of always framed as like being psycho, they're aggressive, they're bitchy. Like there's a certain like vernacular that you would use towards women who are kind of dominant at what they do or just, overall like strong, which is not, what society frames as like typical for a woman. And to give an example of that, I have Daenerys from Game of Thrones, who is a famous woman from television. And she is somebody who kind of has to find this way towards being kind of like a weaker like character. She's not super strong-willed, so eventually coming into her power and becoming this bitch. But she's kind of like, she's a leader, she's ferocious, she's, strong. And I think it's a really good character arc that shows that women can be more than just, docile, but it does also frame it even within itself. I would say it's more of a woke perspective where it's, the show is aware that the men around her think she's a bitch. She's not actually a bitch, but the men around her think that she is. So it's kind of like self-aware of the trope, but it's not always like this. There are other women in television who are portrayed as being, strong, but then also are erratic or they're rude or, you know, all of that. And within like a professional setting, women have to like kind of think about how they're seen just as like, a general thing. Like a man doesn't have to think about the way he's seen. He kind of just can be in a room and be dominant or be, shy or, whatever. He doesn't really have to think about that. But a woman has to kind of always think about what other people are thinking of her within that professional setting. And then for chapter 10, work and achievement, the article kind of makes the point that for this, I focus more on like the work and achievement side as like women are coming into like motherhood or like, trying to figure out like a work-life balance as they kind of like are getting older. It was kind of the perspective I have of it. The article made the point that whenever a woman has like a serious career in television, usually she has a home life that suffers. Or if she has a great home life, then her work life suffers. It's never like you can't have both. It's always one or the other that's gonna be bad. Or if you don't have a home life and you have a good like work life, then the show would usually just portray you as like being like promiscuous. And it's never really like that for a man, but it is always like that for a woman. So to give an example, I have Miranda from Sex and the City who, and honestly, any of the four ladies from Sex and the City would work great here. But Miranda in particular is a mother, so she works here. She kind of is a great lawyer, and then she has a baby, and then it's like this struggle in her story about trying to find time for herself, work, and the baby. And whenever she does great at work, her, her relationship with her baby kind of gets strained because then she doesn't see him as often. But whenever she's like focused on her baby a lot, then her life with her friends starts to suffer, her work starts to suffer. And it's like this expectation that you kind of have to have it all figured out. That's really kind of like, a lot of pressure. So yeah, I think her in particular, the show does a really good job of showing that struggle, but not all television is obviously going to do a great job of showing, you can do both and you can be great at both, but you can be bad at both, I guess. Kind of like, I guess like Fiona from Shameless would be a good example, where she's kind of like all over the place, trying to figure out her home life and then her work life. Society kind of like has this idea of like how a woman should be just great at everything. She should, especially now in our modern time, like have a career, have a family, have it all figured out. It's like, it's kind of, it's a lot of pressure to have that expectation on yourself, but then also to have society have that expectation of you. And that isn't really something that's reflected on men. It's usually just for women. So yeah, I think the article did a great job of kind of honing in on that. And then for my final thoughts, I think we kind of should have a easier time giving women a space where they can be powerful, assertive, or even if they want to be, not as strong, it's work. I don't necessarily think that at work, I don't necessarily want to be like a leader all the time or any of the time. But I think having a space where women can step into that role and be confident in it and not have to think about whether they come across as bitchy or arrogant or what have you. I think that would be very conducive to having, just a better space for those women because who wants to feel like they have to act a certain way at work uh, or and any aspect of their life. Um, I also think we should see why, in particular, women have to be acting a certain way and men don't, especially when they have very similar character traits. But then women have to like repress it, but then men get to like flourish into it, especially in like those like higher end careers. And I also think that within television itself, how it's portrayed, I am very thankful for these characters, these women of television, especially like, Daenerys, Sex and the City. This is a character from American Horror Story, but these women who kind of step into their power and, own it. But I also think there is a lot of room for improvement as to how women can just be good at something and not have to have it be like some extenuating factor. Like you can just be a good nurse. You don't have to abuse pills. You can be a good detective. You don't have to have some, disorder that makes you good at it. And then you kind of are self-destructive in all other aspects of your life. I think there's plenty of men in television who are just good at what they do. And I think there could be women who are just good at what they do. But yeah, it's my presentation. Thank you.